Okay, we are live.
We are.
And welcome to the Mentionables Live. Tonight, we're diving in to take a look at misunderstood, misquoted, and often challenged difficult Bible passages. So that's where we're going tonight. So stick around. Maybe depending on our time, we'll even have time to hit up some in the chat. So go ahead, start throwing questions and comments in there. If you have particular things you want us to address, and we'll see how far we get. But sit back and enjoy the show. I'm Caleb Johnston. Over here to my right,
Joel Vergis.
next to him,
I am Clinton Wilcox, and I am just a soul whose intentions are good. Oh, Lord, please don't let me be misunderstood.
down here below Clinton.
I'm Nick Peters of Deeper Waters Apologetics, and I affirm the virgin birth.
Good to hear. It'd been a while since we'd heard that. And
So we know that Nick is free from apostasy for a few minutes now.
And over here next to Nick,
I am Steve Schramm, and I don't really have a cool tagline.
well, we figured the Bible nerd would be especially good since we're addressing difficult Bible passages tonight.
Yeah. This is so exciting. I got a little giddy when I saw the subject matter for tonight. So
All right.
I wouldn't call them difficult Bible passages like in trying to figure out what Paul's talking about in Romans or something like that. These are just,
weird.
weird Bible stories.
Fun.
Perfect. Well, unless anybody wants to chit chat, let's dive in.
All right, so I brought this up because this is like a giant twit episode for some reason that I cannot describe because I don't know. I was added to a Filipino atheist group. I first, denied the ad, but they kept trying to add me and I eventually accepted. And so I see, memes and things posted around there. And I got hit within like the same day with 3 different bizarre Bible stories. These are, of course, Old Testament stories that possibly misunderstood, but they definitely end up on like badbible.com or, these atheist sites that like, they never teach you this in Sunday school kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the passage in question, and then we'll do a panel discussion on the question. I figure our Bible nerd and Nick Peters, who has some competency in the culture surrounding the Old Testament, probably would start us off because they're going to be able to tackle these out of the gate. They probably dealt with them dozens of times. But I wanted to do them because I had dealt with them in the comments and had the arguments, so they're fresh in my head.
All right, fair enough. So what's going to be our first one to tackle tonight?
I'm going to read the verses. This is a passage from Genesis 38. And it goes, starting at verse 6. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go in to your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground so as not to give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, Remain a widow in your father's house till Selah, my son, grows up, for he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went in and remained in her father's house. Now, I read the entire passage, which gives you the context, but oftentimes when you hear it, you'll hear just verse 9, which I suppose you can guess which verse that is. It's the one of spilling, whatsoever on the ground and whatnot. So,
What do you
there's
mean
the
by
passage.
whatsoever, Joe?
Semen. Spilling the semen.
Oh!
Onan spilling his man juice on the ground.
And I affirm a virgin birth.
Yeah.
Well, there wasn't any
See, we're
virgin
gonna have
birth in
some
this
fun
story.
with this one.
I was gonna throw up this cartoon of Onan the Barbarian, but it's definitely not appropriate for the channel. So I apologize for even considering throwing that up on the screen.
Well, if we're going to start discussing, I'll go ahead and throw some things out. First off, contrary to what a lot of biblical pastors and well-meaning teachers said for years, this passage is not about masturbation. You have to go to other grounds for that one. This is not
Is
that
it like
passage.
the passage that the entire Catholic doctrine of masturbation is built around?
It could be.
con-
It's known as a sin of onanism.
Yeah,
But
no,
what's weird-
it's contraception, not masturbation that they get this that they take from this verse.
Yeah, what's really
Okay, that
going
makes more
on
sense.
in this one is Onan is greedy. He knows that if Tamar has kids, that his empire, his wealth per se, is going to have to go to a son that's not going to be his, and he's going to lose his inheritance. So he denies her birthright. She's supposed to have it. She's supposed to have a child to provide for her. He does that, which is wicked enough. And then he does it in an effort to keep what he wants for himself, while at the same time trying to have fun doing it. I mean, he could have easily just said, no, I refuse to marry her, and that would have been it. But nope, he decided to act the part. His sin is a sin of greed.
Okay, so Nick, just for our listeners who don't know the Old Testament context in which you're speaking, he would go in and he'd, have the baby with her. Why wouldn't the baby be his? And what's this whole duty of the brother-in-law thing?
Yes. That's
Try
right,
to
Lars.
explain it as if the person has never read the Bible.
Yeah, in that context, if a man died and he left no children to his wife to provide for her, in order to avoid his name being blotted out from history, his brother was supposed to step up and marry his brother's wife, and the children, well, at least the first one, would be the child of the first brother who died in that case, and that would mean that the inheritance would pass on to him. Is that what you were wanting?
Yeah, I mean, if you hadn't read the Bible, if you were not familiar with the Old Testament law and, the ancient Near East context, then this wouldn't make any sense. We have another story in the Bible of a widow who's fighting for her widow rights, which is much more romantic than this one, correct?
We have a few stories like that.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I mean, I think you're thinking about the story of Ruth, though. At
I
this
am
point.
thinking of the story of Ruth.
Yeah.
So
Or
this
you
is
want-
something that is commanded in Levitical law as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's because in the ancient Near East, a childless widow would have been made it difficult to live. And so it was, commanded in Levitical law that, the widow is protected insofar as the brother-in-law goes in and takes the brother's place, so to speak, and provides a child on behalf of the brother, so that the widow is protected anyway, the widow is protected. And there's a great deal of Old Testament law about the protection of widows. So the Old Testament has, widows are to be treated well. And I suppose widowhood was a much bigger problem back then than it is now.
And something fascinating about the book of Ruth is pretty much every single character in that book is named. Even the minor characters that don't do anything, such as the original grooms of Orpah and Ruth, are named. They pretty much die immediately. The only person who is not named is the one who fails to fulfill his duty.
Yeah, that's correct. Now, let me ask y'all another question. This story is fresh on my mind for a couple reasons, but what do Tamar and Ruth have in common? Any takers?
I know the answer.
Okay,
They are both in the genealogy of Christ in Matthew.
that's exactly right. And so is Bathsheba.
Who's not even named.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so is Rahab. And so, one of the questions is, well, what are they doing there? And I know the pastoral point, right? The pastoral point that's often made is, well, praise God. It just shows that even Jesus came from the line of wicked, women. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe there's, even, all these people were in the line of Jesus, and, Jesus, overcame sin, even though, back in his genealogy that, I get that point, but it really does make you wonder, like, why? Like, that's one of those weird things to me in the Bible. Why these four? Why, of all the women, like, why wasn't Rebecca mentioned, or like Deborah, or like why? Like, so obviously, I believe everything is intentional, right? I believe that God designed His word the way that He did, and so without getting too far into the weeds here, there's an interesting argument that anybody who knows me wouldn't be surprised to find that I mentioned Michael Heiser's name when it comes into the connection of this. But there's actually an argument to be made that's been put forth by a lady. I think her name is Amy, but I forget the last name. It was in 2010 that she wrote an article in a journal that connected the idea of Jesus's genealogy to the story of Tamar and the story of Ruth, and also Bathsheba and Rahab, to the whole ancient Near Eastern Watchers story, the sons of God in Genesis 6, the Enochian Watchers story, and all of that. And I won't go too deep down that, but this is a weird Bible passage that we're talking about. And just to give a quick summary, I know I'm probably losing a lot of people, but one of the things about ancient Jewish theology was that while Adam, of course, was responsible for sort of the introduction of sin into the world, the mass proliferation of sin into the world was blamed a lot on the event that is just briefly mentioned in the Bible in Genesis 6, where the so-called Watchers, or Genesis 6 calls them the sons of God, came onto the earth. And part of what they did was to spread witchcraft and sorcery. There were so-called dark arts that these guys supposedly taught the women and men, and corrupted them. And if you noticed, you have in each of these stories connected with Bathsheba and Rahab and Ruth, and also with Tamar, you have some of these elements going on. And so, again, the theological idea is supposed to be, at least by this argument, is the thread is tied together in Jesus, that part of Jesus's genealogy is designed and structured the way it is, and history even is structured and designed the way it is, to signal that Jesus was part of the reversal of that proliferation of sin. So, of course, not only rescuing sinners in the sense of being redeemed and having a savior, but also literally turning around the moral imperfection that the world gave us through supposedly these individuals. So it's just an interesting theological thread that helps you. It gives me a more satisfying answer as to why is this person mentioned in Jesus's genealogy, beyond either one, some coincidence that she was, or two, just that we're supposed to draw from this a pastoral point. It seems like there's more there, and this gives me a satisfying, I think, reason for that, and helps connect some of the other dots. So that's just, I'll just go ahead and make the passage a little bit more weird for everybody.
Well, it's interesting how this ties in too, not only in bringing in the Ruth story because it's comparative in a sense, but it's actually a restoration of the promise that's lost here in Genesis 38, because the genealogy can't continue, and this is the line, the Davidic line that's coming. So, I mean, this is where the Messiah is supposed to come from.
That's right. And one of the other elements that the lady who wrote the paper, it was either Amy or Rebecca, I'll have to look up her name, but one of the things that she brought up is in each of these stories, you actually see a righteous outcome that comes from as the ultimate result of an unrighteous act. And even at different points throughout the story, like you can notice it in verse verse 21, it says there's been no cult prostitute here. So you have cult prostitution mentioned. I was going to
say the story gets even more bizarre past that.
Yeah, it does. It does. The word comes from the same Semitic root as the word watcher, right? So there's some really cool stuff going on in this text, but you miss it, right? Because and I know of a pastor he's passed away now, but I know of a pastor who latched onto this passage and literally did use this passage as being the main teaching point of this passage is justification, actually, for Christians to masturbate. And I'm sitting here thinking, like, really? That this awesome passage has been given to us by the God of the universe to help like tie all these threads together, and we get from it that we should masturbate. I'm sorry, like, you know what I mean? Like, good. You still have the parental advisory up. Like, there's just more to it, way more to it than that, and that's even a wrong conclusion to take from it. So,
yeah, they make a lot out of what's going on in this chapter that's unnecessary.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I mean, did we just briefly touch on the remainder of this story, how it progresses? Because you mentioned the cult prostitute part. Do you want to just find out how she finally got satisfaction?
Yeah, Nick, you want to take it?
No satisfaction.
Nick seems to have a better handle on the progression of the story than I do. I don't know if he wants to kind of finish that out with.
That's only if for Papa is a Rolling Stone, though.
Okay, well, yeah, I can finish it out. Okay, so now this woman, Tamar, it's not said in the text, but it would be understood that if she has two husbands and both of them die and they don't leave kids, well, geez, maybe the problem is her. And so Judah is thinking, yeah, I don't want to give a third son here. I'm going to be childless. He's going to die. And so tomorrow...
Is that like how Taylor Swift complains about all the boys that have mistreated her? And, the problem probably has more to do with it.
Yeah, and Tamar then is really being shamed and ignored by her father-in-law. And she puts on this veil and goes waiting outside the gate, and Judah comes by, and Judah doesn't even recognize his own daughter-in-law with a veil on. That's how out of touch he is. He thinks she's a cult prostitute, so he offers to sleep with her, and she says, well, I want your rod and cord that are in your hand, but was typical gear for a shepherd of the time, and I'll hold that until you can give me a sheep from your flock. So he goes and sleeps with her. Disgusting, yes, but that's what happens. And
yeah, the Old Testament doesn't hold anything back, does it?
It doesn't. And she gets pregnant, and when he's told about it, Judah is incensed because in his mind, she shamed him and says, well, she must die. Where she's got some insurance there, so she brings out this rod and cord and says, can you tell me who these belong to? This guy's the father. Do you know who this is? And then he realizes he's trapped. And that's the story.
Yeah. I mean, to a degree, it's interesting that this story involves a woman who fights for the rights that she was, accorded by the word of God. This was a right that was given to widows by the law. Now, granted, that law wouldn't have been given to them until many years after the events of this passage, but nevertheless, it was clearly understood because Judah turned to his son and said, give her the rights of a widow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Judah would probably have known that God was involved in this because God killed 2 of his sons already, and yet he's going into a cult prostitute.
Yeah.
So Judah is not blameless in this.
Nope, he's not.
All right, so if we're finished with that passage, I'll get on to the next weird one.
Yeah, let's have it.
All right,
Well,
this one. Go ahead.
A real quick note, I think one of the big takeaways for people from this is that when you encounter something weird like this in the Bible, it's worth doing a little more looking into because it can make a big difference in terms of understanding. Yeah, it's a really out of place, weird story, a lot of bad stuff going on in it that shouldn't have been the way things were, but this is a telling of history that recounts the lineage of the Messiah, and it connects to other parts of the Bible in a way that's radically amazing. I mean, that's the only word for it. So I think the big takeaway is to just take some time and do a little research, pull up a commentary, when you encounter something like this.
Yeah, I'll underscore that.
Yeah, and I made the mistake of...
Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry, guys. So I'll just underscore that. I did a video about this one time, I think a while back, where I just said, look, when you encounter something strange in the Bible, usually that's a signal that you need to dive in. Because whereas most people pull away and say, oh, that's too weird for me, they skip over it and get to something a little bit more comfortable or a little bit more Sunday schooly. Usually, when you start to dig in deeper, those are where the real riches come from in studying the Bible. You open up almost a whole new world that you never knew existed. So it's really fun.
And I made the mistake of reading that in context because the atheist will throw the one verse out and say, look how bizarre the Bible is. So I accidentally read the surrounding context and it cleared a lot up just by reading the passage.
It's amazing how many of these atheists engage in cultural bigotry where they assume that their culture is superior and they don't bother to understand a culture that's different than theirs. I thought we were supposed to be more tolerant like that.
Yeah, that's the other thing is that they'll read the passage and they'll say, look how bizarre the Bible is. It's not realistic at all. Okay, what was she going to do? Go to a women's shelter, maybe? I don't know. Maybe go get a manicure and go out to the club and see if she can meet a new guy. The ancient world worked a little differently than the world does now. You're viewing it from a 21st century standpoint and how we think and behave. And that's not how they thought and behaved back then.
I think she was going to go appear on Oprah next.
Yeah, probably.
So let's go to the next story.
Okay. This one I'm going to try to read just the passage that's bizarre and not include the surrounding context because, dang it, that just ruins the whole making fun of the Bible thing.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So this is 2 Kings chapter 2, starting at verse 23. Those of you who are familiar with the Bible probably already know which story this is. All right.
This is the story of Jesus, isn't it?
Yeah. It's the one where he does the thing with the birds or I don't know. Then he went up from there to Bethel. And he was going up by the way. Young lads came out of the city and mocked him and said to him, go up, you bald head. Go up, you bald head. When he looked behind him and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 female bears came out of the woods and tore up 42 lads of their number And he went from there to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. Okay, so here's the problem. You've got these pure, innocent little children that are coming out, and they call a guy bald. Oh, well. And this God turns around, and he curses them. And then 2 giant wild animals come out from the woods and start tearing into them and kill 42 of these small children whose only transgression was making fun of this guy for being bald. What a terrible story. What a terrible story.
I'm sorry, teacher. I have to correct you on a few points you got wrong in your story.
I just read what the passage said, man.
Well, let's start off with these were not small little boys. You
It said little children. It said little children.
Sorry, the word that's used is also used to describe soldiers in the army. Likely these could have been very well teenagers at the time, not little children. Second, they weren't just making fun of Elisha because he was bald. They were saying was go up to bald head because that was a symbol that he was a prophet then, and they were saying go ahead and get lost just like Elijah did. Get out of here. If this was a generation that was rejecting the way of God, so then these 2 bears come out. There's only one kind of bear in the area, Syrian brown bears. And they weigh at the most 550 pounds. So let's go with 600 pounds, just to be generous. 2 600-pound bears. And we know there were at least 43 kids there. Because, 42 got hurt. And the answer is always 42, of course. But 42 of them get injured. I
think that answers the entire story right there. The number 42. We can move on.
Yeah, let's move on to the next one.
Yeah, but see, the thing with this is that 2 bears are not going to be able to go through 43 youth, at least, unless some of these kids decide they're going to fight back, which is possible. You could carry a weapon with you in that time to keep yourself safe from marauders or wild animals or anything like that. You could be wanting bear meat. You could be wanting some honor that comes from fighting animals off like bears, anything. But that 42 of them got injured tells you these kids put up a fight. And the text doesn't say they were mauled. The word, again, could mean something like that. It could just mean they were scratched, they were injured in some way, anything like that. But this was a big threat to Elisha. And the destruction that took place there was a sign that God was saying, I'm not putting up with this.
All right. So I can take the story. I'll give you mine. This is a capstone of a larger cycle of stories that begins with the ascension of Elijah. Elijah is sort of a legendary character, a larger-than-life character in Jewish literature. And he still holds significant value in the Jewish religion. And so here you have the prototypical prophet who ascends into heaven. That's a big part of the story. And now he passes the mantle, both figuratively and literally, to his follower, Elisha. And so Elisha comes back, and he tells the disciples of Elijah that Elijah has kind of ascended into heaven. And the disciples decide to go ahead and search the countryside anyway. So they're a little skeptical of this whole thing. So they search the countryside, and they don't find Elijah. And so, prior to that, when Elijah had passed his cloak to Elisha, Elisha had struck the water with a cloak and parted the water. And this sort of was signifying the fact that he was the successor to Elijah. This was kind of the prototypical miracle performed by successors. Joshua did this as well when Moses passed the mantle to him. And so he parted the water, which is sort of a sign and wonder kind of miracle. It didn't serve any sort of practical purpose, but it was there to show that the power of God was on this prophet. So after the whole searching of the countryside, Elisha goes into a city, and they've got sort of a water problem. There's an issue with the water it's undrinkable. And so he, story short, he purifies the water. Now, this is sort of a nod to Moses as well, because this is kind of the thing that happened at Mara with the bitter waters. And so now he's done a public miracle. So he's done a sign and wonder. Now he's done a public miracle, which is a beneficial miracle. This is a miracle that actually benefits people. So it actually serves a purpose. And so now he's wandering up the countryside, and these people, these youths, come out and start saying, "Go up, you bald one." Now, as Nick has mentioned, the transgression here is not the bald head part. It's the go up part. This is shortly after he has told the story of Elijah ascending to heaven, and it seems as if they're skeptical of his story, kind of like the disciples who had to search the countryside. These youths are, questioning the legitimacy of the story, be like, okay, well, why don't you go up? Show us how it's done. The other thing is the bald head part, probably he was in mourning, so he had shaved his head, which was a part of mourning tradition in that time. And so the mention of the bald head may even be them kind of questioning the sincerity of his mourning. He just happened to get the power of the prophet, lucky him, kind of thing. And so they're mocking his story, or mocking him as the successor, and he performs the third kind of miracle, which is a curse. And he does a Levitical curse because, God said that he would send wild animals to drive them out from the land. So this is a direct reference to a Levitical curse that occurs there. And then, the rest is what Nick said. I'd like to focus on the number 42, first of all, because it's the answer to life, the universe, and everything. And second of all, because it's somewhat of an unrealistic number if you take the story at face value. You got two bears. There's 42 kids. If each bear takes 21, divides them evenly. Let's say it takes 5 seconds for a bear to maul a kid and move on. Then you have 42 kids standing around for almost 2 minutes while these bears are running around mauling them. You'd think a couple might run away, rather than stand there for bears to maul them. So it's possible that what Nick said is true. It's possible that the number 42 is inflated because, as I understand it, numbers in the Bible are notoriously inflated during transmission. So anyway, that would be my take on it.
Wait. No, are you telling me you're not taking the text literally?
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Obvious heresy right there. We're supposed to always take the text literally, aren't we?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I have to hand in my fundamentalist card.
Well, that's a good handling of that passage there, boys. I don't think I have anything to add to that. That's awesome. I totally agree, for what it's worth.
All right.
Again, I was going to throw up some art here, but for fear of us getting some kind of YouTube strike for featuring violence and gore on the channel, but most of the images are very characterized as we talked about with the start of this passage.
You know what? Maybe I will say I'll go ahead and play Caleb for a second and just kind of take away some maybe a practical thing or two here. I don't know. I sure enough have heard this verse and this whole passage actually. Like I've been in a study context where the kind of the attitude towards it was, well, I believe what the text literally says, and questioning that any further just is a moot point. Why it says little children, it says 42. It's like it says these things, right? Like, and so again, it's a lot of the points that Nick made, if we're making it somewhat practical here, are things that if you understood what the Hebrew words meant, you wouldn't draw the same literal conclusion. Now, this raises other questions. Is that the least graphic one you could find? That's awesome. Yeah. It raises other questions as to the nature of inspiration and preservation and all of that. Certainly, I won't go down all that road, but I was just looking here at the Faith Life Study Bible, and it makes the point that on the word "go up," sure enough, the Hebrew word that is used there is the same word that is used for Elijah's ascent to heaven, right? So the original reader would have literally read that and made that literal connection. That we don't literally make. Again, the same thing with the word that's used for young boys. There's actually or little children, depending on what you're reading. There actually is no age given and no even indication of the age given in the passage if you read the Hebrew word. And so there would have been the assumption there, given the nature of what was going on, there would have kind of been, I'm loving this, man. These images are awesome. There would have kind of, we are bringing assumptions to the story that the original reader would not have brung. They would have brung different assumptions as they were literally reading it, right? So we have to remember what it means to read a text literally. You can read this literally as a Jewish person, or an ancient Israelite, maybe I should say, and come away with it as being something different than what you read at a first glance in an English Bible. So,
right. And when it's taken out of context and just, thrown up there by an atheist on a meme,
right.
It's easy to focus on the bald head part and not the go up part, which is really where the stress would have been in context, especially considering what had just happened earlier in the passage.
Yeah. And that's kind of the frustration, right? Is like, these kind of somewhat fringe, well, I wish it were fringe. It's less fringe than I wish. But these atheist groups where they'll throw this stuff up there, see, hey, look at how ridiculous the Bible is. And it's kind of like, can't you give it the benefit of the doubt for like 2 seconds? I mean, do you really think the point of the passage is that a bear mauled the guy or a bear mauled these little kids for calling him a bald guy? Like, it seems naive to even think like to take away that immediate thing. Like, it doesn't impress you to desire to look into it closer. But no, I mean, if you're wanting to make the Bible look like a foolish thing, then rip a verse out of its context and take it with wooden literalism. I mean, my Bible says Jesus is literally a door, so there, what have you. Just let's be careful, you know what I mean, and let's actually care about this a little bit and dig deeper.
Yeah, if you don't think of the Bible as sort of ancient literature and the way that ancient literature works, it would be easy to see it as sort of a collection of Grimm's fairy tales where, bizarre things happen for no real reason. The guy's eyes get punctured with thorns and then the girl cries on the eyes and they get healed. And, can you believe they believe this stuff? Yeah. This is not Hans Christian Andersen. This is ancient literature. It functions by different rules. And if you actually read a full passage, you'd realize there's a whole story going on here, like an entire narrative that connects to Genesis 1, and progressing upward versus just a just so story that's plopped down and, is a kid's story or something.
I found this interesting, even in just looking up images. It's very interesting. I'm not sure when this one is from. I'm going to throw this advisory up here. I'm going to show one more real quick. This one's a little more graphic. This is a very modern piece of art done. However, you also see stuff like this, which is a medieval French painting that seems to be more theologically accurate in terms of looking at it. You see the context of Elijah going up. You see kids who appear to be, young men. So it's interesting that, this is something that's even maybe relatively modern in terms of how it's been contextualized to be a different story than what the Bible actually makes it.
Great observation.
The thing is that atheists really like to consider themselves people of reason, but in this case, the whole thing seems to be that offends me, or that makes me think God's being a big meanie. And it's really an emotional appeal instead of just really going and bothering to study the text just a little bit.
Yeah, it's kind of like Luke in the cave at Dagobah. You bring your own. When you bring your own weapons into the passage, you bring your own destruction as well. You have only what you bring with you.
Mm-hmm.
That's a legit theological point. All right, we ready to move on?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so this story probably deserves its entirely own episode, but we haven't been on. We've been on for like what, an hour now?
40 minutes.
40 minutes, yeah.
40 minutes. All right, we've got
We're-
another solid hour to go. Right?
Yeah,
Wait,
we're ripping through
I'm
this pretty
just-
quick.
I'm just wondering, are we going to talk about that crazy story where the woman in Bethlehem who hasn't ever had relations with a man gives birth to the God of the universe? I was hoping we would get to that one at some point, but
Well, I'm
go
pretty
ahead
sure
with whatever one you planned on doing next.
I'm pretty sure Nick has never actually heard that story before.
I do affirm the virgin birth.
All right, and he shows us the upward shot of him to be more dramatic. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and read the passage. And the only reason I'm doing these three, I specifically selected these three because these were the ones I had just been challenged on in order the same day. So considering that I'd responded to all three, I felt equipped to do this episode. All right, so this is from Genesis chapter 22. It says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they both went together. When they came to the place of which God had told them, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood on order and bound Isaac his son, laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing as how you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Okay, let me just finish. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in the thicket with thorns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it in burnt offering, etc. Okay, and we're back.
So, was there a particular element of this story that was pointed out to you that makes this story so weird, or does it not sound weird because I was raised in church? Maybe that's the problem.
Well,
sounds normal to me. This happens all the time.
Let me lay out what a thumbnail sketch of the atheist argument here. First of all, God is quote unquote testing Abraham. When God should know everything, right? So God should already know that Abraham, blah, 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 and yet he puts Abraham through this cruel thing. Second of all, God is essentially lying to Abraham because he knows that he's not really going to let Abraham sacrifice his son, but he's saying, go up and take your son and, sacrifice him. Third of all, this makes God into a cruel manipulative. It's kind of a Loki kind of god. He's a jokester god, right? He just messes with people and takes this poor guy who's just had a son in his old age, and it stresses in the passage the son he loves, and then he puts them through the psychological torture of having to take his kid up and sacrifice him. Choose God or choose a son. And then finally, okay, so this all works out in the end. What's the point? Why would God choose this psychological torture of a guy with these, dangling the sacrificing of his son out there? It's a bizarre story. It serves no point. It shows that God is a meanie. Okay, that's the best I can.
Yeah. So I once actually heard or saw someone who had some knowledge of the text talk about this, and the way that she explained it, I think it was one of the ladies who teaches at Houston Baptist University. The way that she explained it was that, Abraham at this point did not have, the scriptures, and there wasn't much known about the Hebrew God Yahweh at this point. Some scholars even say that the Hebrews before, in the time before they had the scriptures, were actually polytheistic, and then they eventually became monotheistic once enough knowledge was learned. They kind of had this progressive revelation kind of thing going on. But at this point, Abraham, there were a number of pagan gods in surrounding cultures who, gods like Baal and Molech and others who did say you have to sacrifice your children for some kind of benefit to make life better in some way for a crop or whatever. And so Abraham did not know that Yahweh was not the kind of God who would require sacrifices. And so this was actually Yahweh's sort of Yahweh's way of introducing the concept that this is not something that God commands. God, being the only God and being a good and righteous God, would not command parents to sacrifice their children. And so this was God's way of showing Abraham that this is not the way that he wants worship. And so that's the way that I heard it explained.
Yeah, and you're actually with that thread there, you're hitting at something that is just a very prevalent idea in general in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew Bible, because kind of the whole point, even if you look at the Exodus, if you look at the children of Israel as they're being led out of Egypt, and the whole polemical idea that's going on against the gods of Egypt, so much of what of the events that go on in the Old Testament, and sometimes this is evident in the writing, but it's also just kind of evident in reality in scenes like this, where it was very important that Yahweh show himself as distinct from these other gods. And this is, definitely one of those ways, one of those stories in which you can certainly see that. Again, the Exodus is another one. The item with is it Elijah and on Mount Carmel, Elijah and the prophets of Baal? Is it Elijah or Elisha? I always get them mixed up. I think it's Elijah. Yeah, it is Elijah. Yeah, and so you have all of these events go on that constantly place Yahweh in contradistinction to the other gods of the ancient Near East. So that's definitely an important thing you see there. Another one that I'd like to mention is there's a video done by the Bible Project guys called The Test. And we may, share that with you or link you up to it. I don't know. But this video, I think, is a really, really good one. So it really goes through and draws. So it's called one of their theme videos. So it has the theme of the test in Scripture, which you see over and over and over again. You have it with Abraham. You have it with Moses. Moses has to take the test. Joseph takes the test. Jesus takes the test. And of course, in different You see this mentioned a little bit in Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith chapter. But you have different characters throughout biblical history who, in some ways, passed the test. And yet, even those who passed the test still, in other ways, failed, right? They were moral failures. Abraham was a great man. He was a man of great faith. He passed the test. He had loyalty to Yahweh, but yet he failed. David showed loyalty to Yahweh, and yet in his moral life and relationships, he failed. So Jesus was the only one throughout recorded history to pass the test and never fail morally or spiritually or physically in any way. And so I just think that's a really interesting part of this too. Abraham is called a friend of God. He's considered really close with God. And so rather than to, I guess kind of the atheist argument is again a little bit anachronistic, look at this mean God or whatever. But I mean, when you have the God of the universe who supernaturally creates a people for himself and says, I'm going to love you, I'm going to take care of you. All you have to do is be loyal to me. And that was the test. And Abraham passed that test in this case with flying colors, and God knew that he could trust him to do what he needed him to do. And, he promises him that he's going to make of his people a great nation, and they shall be as the sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky. And it's because he passed the test. And so I think that video might help you to get a overall, again, it's called The Test by the Bible Project. That might help you get a sense for this theme throughout scripture and how Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of that.
I'd like to speak to the test element if I may.
Sure.
The objection here, one often sees, the objection is God knows everything. God should already have known that, Abraham was faithful and not had to put him through something like this. And it's similar to the argument of why would I have to pray to God for anything if he already knows everything? He'll know what I want, etc. All right. So I'm going to address this, and what I'm going to talk about is somewhat hypothetical and not always agreed upon, but I'm going to talk about God's foreknowledge a bit in order to address this. And if you have objections to that, to what I say, you might. All right, so that's the whole objection. God has foreknowledge. God should already have known about Abraham and so on and so forth. Here's the thing. You can't have foreknowledge about something that didn't happen. So the entire thing of why should I pray if God already knows the future? Well, God won't know what you're praying in the future if you don't pray. God's foreknowledge may have been from the foundations of the earth, but he's not going to foreknow something that didn't happen. So here's a proposition. I mean, if you think about what Abraham went through, God comes to him and calls him from a pagan land and asks him to follow God to a location that God does not disclose to him immediately. He's got to kind of follow this leading. God says, I'm taking you to a place and I'll let you know when we get there, kind of thing. And it's not dissimilar to what happened to the children of Israel in the 40 years in the wilderness. I mean, they're following God around, wandering around the same area of land for 40 years before God finally takes them to the place that they're supposed to go, which happens to be the same place that Abraham went. But that's not the only element of what happened with Abraham, because God says, I am going to give you offspring. And that's very, very, very important to a person in the ancient Near East. And probably even today, if you live and die without any offspring, there's this sense of having your name and your legacy and your life die out with you, versus having an offspring to sort of carry on the generations after you. But in the ancient Near East, it was that much more important for similar reasons. So, Abraham is old and he doesn't have any offspring, and that's bothersome to him, and God promises that he will. And that's all fine and well, except for years and years and years and years go by, and he's getting older and older, and his wife's getting older and older, and he still hasn't had this offspring. And God keeps saying, yeah, it's going to happen. I swear, someday. And so there's this, this element of patience and trust. Is God really going to give me this offspring? He hasn't done it. It's not happening. It's not happening. But for some reason, I have to be patient and wait for this thing to happen, which seems more and more improbable every day that goes by. And yet, apparently, Abraham was his man because he did stick with God with some minor diddling on the side, but that was his wife's idea, not his. So we'll just stick with that. Anyway, so eventually he does receive the promise from God. So, the element of his faith being tested has kind of already happened in the sense that he wandered for years and years and years until God took him to the promised place. And he spent years and years and years waiting for an offspring until God finally gave him the promised offspring. And then after that, there's this whole test of his faith. Let me suggest to you that before God called him out of the pagan land and took him wandering in the wilderness and promised him an offspring that wouldn't come for many years, God foreknew this test that Abraham went through. God knew about this test that would happen in the future, and he knew that Abraham would pass. But that only happened because the test was conducted. Abraham, he would not have passed that test, and that knowledge would not have occurred unless the test actually happened. And so the foreknowledge argument doesn't really work if the thing didn't happen. I can't, for instance, know all the details about a train wreck which will never actually happen.
Well, now that raises the question, though, doesn't God have knowledge of counterfactuals? Because, for example, God did say that, he talked about the people I'm forgetting the context, but where he talked about that, certain people were committing sins and that Sodom and Gomorrah would have repented had they had the prophets or something like that. And so they didn't actually have to repent in order for God to know that they would have. So I'm not sure that really I'm not really sure that solves the problem, because it seems that God would still know that Abraham would have passed the test, even if he didn't put Abraham through it.
Okay, that's a fair question. And that's more for a Molinist. Any of us Molinists?
Yes, emphatically so.
Yeah, I'm not a Molinist, but I still affirm that God has knowledge of counterfactuals.
Well, but what's interesting though, and so I've read some on Molinism, but most of what I know on Molinism is from watching countless Dr. Craig videos and
Dr. Craig,
Doctor
Craig?
Who, yeah. If you don't know, it's too bad for you.
I'm going to right quick before you finish it. Just say it's late. I gotta be going, but if anybody wants to find me, I'm at deeperwatersapologetics.com, and I affirm the virgin birth.
Peace
right,
out,
have a
Nick.
good night.
Thanks so much, man.
Thanks for joining us, Nick.
So most of what I knew about Molinism prior to about a week ago was just stuff I'd learned from videos and from talking with people and being in the Molinist Facebook groups, etc. But I read Craig Only Wise God last week, and that is sort of his argument for a Molinist view of sovereignty and free will, in specifically in refutation of theological fatalism. And so an interesting kind of nugget that I gleaned from that, which made a whole lot of sense, which it just never really computed with me before. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm just dumb and I never picked it up before, but I picked it up while I was reading the book, that the many objections to God's foreknowledge can be on a Molinist view, where God knows counterfactuals logically prior to his creation of the world, actually would become the basis for foreknowledge. I never thought of it that way. His foreknowledge of what will happen is based on his foreknowledge of what does happen, or what would happen in certain circumstances. So of course, God knows what can happen, right? Natural knowledge. God knows what will in fact happen in virtue of the world that he created, which is what's called his free knowledge. And then his middle knowledge, of course, is that which would have happened under different circumstances. So I just never thought of it in those terms, that his knowledge of what will happen again, if you're not a Molinist, you might not take this view, but in my view, his knowledge of what will happen is based on his knowledge of what would happen. So I'm not sure that may be a way that the Molinist could characterize. Like, I think that may solve some of the tension there. In other words, if Abraham in a scenario where Abraham did do something different, God would have foreknown something different. So God foreknew that Abraham would respond that way in that particular circumstance, and so it's based on what he knows would happen. That therefore, what will happen. So I think that might be a way to. I don't know if that directly addresses, Clinton, your potential objection there, but I think it might speak to it.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I'm not sure because I haven't read too much on Molinism. I'm not really a Molinist, but I do think it's plausible that God has knowledge of counterfactuals just because He's omniscient. So God knows all true propositions. So God doesn't just know, Abraham did X. He also knows Abraham would have done X had these other situations obtained. So and so that's why I kind of like the explanation that I heard from this other scholar. That it wasn't necessarily for God's benefit that He had Abraham or told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. It was for Abraham's benefit, so that Abraham knew that he was not the kind of God that would require sacrifice.
Yeah,
so
go ahead.
That's why I like that explanation.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I was actually going to circle back around to a similar point in that the objection, Joel, that you raised, while it's understandable while somebody would raise that objection, it also it's heavily biased toward the view that all of this happened for God, that God was the one who needed to see Abraham's faithfulness. When I could even see an argument being made from Romans 15:4, where things that were written aforetime were written for our learning, so that so Christians can learn some things from that were benefited from things that have been done in the past. And so even if the point was nothing other than the theological point to see Jesus as the ultimate fulfillment of the test, like even that would be enough for me to see it there. But it's obvious that Abraham learned something for himself. I think the point I wanted to make was that I think this underscores in an unusual way God's utter love for humanity. And I guess what I mean by that is like it's not all about God. It's not all about what God wants. It is all about God in the sense that He's the creator and the foundation of everything. But God didn't have to create us. It's an unfathomable thought, but God created us because He wanted to share His love with us and for us to be able to spend eternity in a loving family relationship with Him. That just shows the love of God. And so to think that all of these things happen just for the benefit of God, I think is absurd. I think that makes much more sense, at least to me, to think that no, like this is all part of God's plan in showing His love for humanity and creating a people for Himself, and this was part of the process that it went through, and because of free will, He wanted people who would be loyal to Him, and so these are scenarios. These are very human scenarios that if they would have happened differently, God would have foreknown different facts. So the foreknowledge thing, it's just if you get around the fatalist argument, which basically says fatalism basically says that. Theological fatalism basically says that because God foreknows the future, then the future could not have been any other way, and that supposedly that commits a fallacy in the logic of necessity, which is called modal logic. So there's actually a fallacy in there, and that shows that fatalism is not true because it's the content of God's knowledge that would be affected differently. If I have a bag of pork rinds here, these are literally PORQ. If I had a bag of baconette pork rinds instead, then God would have foreknown that I had baconettes and not pork. It's not, I don't have these because God foreknew it. I have these, therefore God foreknew it, right? It's the other direction. So I think that we just have to think about the goodness and the graciousness of God to let us participate in the bringing about of this world with Him.
Yeah, and I think that is actually a specific fallacy too of confusing cause and effect.
Yeah.
where they they're placing the cause in the wrong place. And I think that
Yeah.
I think that's a recognized fallacy, or at least I think I've heard William Lane Craig describe it as such.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Cal.
I was just going to jump in and say another thing that we shouldn't overlook here within this passage. And I know a lot of Christians won't because they're familiar with this in some sense, but I think the depth of it is really incredible as well, is looking at it from a prophetic standpoint. Because we see a lot of really interesting parallels the deeper you dig into this passage. They were on a 3-day journey. So for 3 days, Abraham thought his son was dead. Then we see this ram caught up in the bushes. We could get speculative there.
I love the Bible. It's so cool.
Oh, me too. And then, one of my favorite things about this one is, of course, who shows up. Everybody says, well, God spoke to Abraham. Well, yes, but in the form of the angel of the Lord, which, is Jesus.
We should do an episode on that sometime.
Yeah, I know, right? So, I think there's a lot of prophetic importance in this passage, too, that can't be overlooked as we're seeing this foreshadowing. Even Jewish tradition and later Christian tradition indicates that, this is actually the same place where the temple was eventually built and was also right there at Golgotha where Jesus died. Now, I don't have any scholarly resources that back up that point per se. I think it's a lot more tradition based, but there's a lot there that can be unpacked from a prophetic standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the go-to for a Christian, is to see this story and immediately think of substitutionary sacrifice and God's sacrifice. There's a lot of that packed into this story, which would not have been understood that way by the original readers, and still isn't understood that way by Jewish readers, but is accepted for other reasons. Since we got into the conversation of foreknowledge and Molinism and so forth, I'll throw out my particular stance on that, which is I'm sure this stance exists elsewhere in some form, but I have never directly read it, so I call it necessary world theology. And it's basically the concept that God exists simultaneously in every moment of every time ever, such that as God is calling Abraham out from his land, he is simultaneously sacrificing his son on the cross, simultaneously creating the world, simultaneously doing all things at the same time, so that God's knowledge is a consequence of him existing simultaneously at all times, performing all actions that God does.
Well, okay. But doesn't that contradict your earlier objection that God can't foreknow something that? Because what you first said is that God can't foreknow something that doesn't happen, but that assumes an A theory of time where temporal becoming is real. What you just said right there assumes a B theory of time, where time is a static thing and God inhabits every moment of it, which I think what you're expressing there is a more technical version of what most people think of when they think of God's timelessness. They think, oh, God's timeless, God's in every moment. Right. But that assumes a B theory of time where all time is kind of static and God inhabits every moment of it. I'm not saying there's, whatever that's right or wrong. I'm just saying, I think it might contradict what you said earlier. If that view is true, then God can foreknow things that haven't happened yet, because in God's time they have.
I think you can rescue my concept, necessary world theology, from a B theory of time, if you understand sort of the generally understood idea of foreknowledge, because even if God does not exist physically in every moment of time, if he has foreknowledge, he exists mentally in every moment of time simultaneously. So God in the future is aware of everything that God in the past knows, is aware of everything that God in the future of that knows. His consciousness, if not his physicality, occupies everything. And I think God's foreknowledge is an extension of God's omnipresence. So if God exists every moment of space, then he could exist every moment of time on a B theory, but he could also exist mentally in every moment of time on an A theory.
See what you're talking about right here. So this is why I mentioned that a moment ago about middle knowledge. Because what you're talking about right here, and I mean, I don't mean this in a disrespectful way. I just mean seriously, to me, that's unintelligible. To me, now I'm not saying that God can't be beyond my understanding. Of course he could, right? But in my mind, I'm trying to think, okay, so like how, if these things haven't happened yet, how does God, like that's the question for the person who wants to hold to the A theory. If these things haven't happened yet, how does God know what their outcome is? And that's when it clicked for me that, oh, duh, by middle knowledge, because he has counterfactual knowledge of what any person would do in any given situation, he therefore knows what a person will do in the world he creates. So what I don't understand about your view, which I respect, I just don't understand it, on a middle knowledge view and a Molinist view, that is solved because God knows that in virtue of his knowledge of counterfactuals. And then whatever world he creates, obviously, is the world in which that thing will happen. So just another perspective on that. But yeah, I think that's interesting.
Okay, so as far as God's foreknowledge, I broke this down once. I'm going to try to remember each of the possibilities that I recall putting together. One possibility is that God is so complex and advanced in mind that he is able to push the first domino and calculate every single domino and the angle that it will fall in the future. Sort of this advanced computation, if you will. Not to compare God to a computer, but sure. If God is so advanced in his knowledge, then he can predict the outcome from the, beginning, which in a sense would be like Molinism because he could predict other outcomes as well, but he could also see the angle at which things going. So that's one odd idea, sort of this advanced predictive capacity. The second idea would be that he declares the future, sort of I don't know, this might be a hyper-Calvinist view, I don't know, but this idea that God knows the future because he directs it. He knows what he will do in the future, and because he knows the story that he's writing ahead of time, that's how he knows the future. So advanced predictive, there is declaration of the future. There's my view, which is that he exists in the future simultaneously to existing in the past. So he knows the future because he's already there. So there's that. And then the final view that I can come up with is sort of this mystical idea, sort of this sort of mystical capacity of God being God and spiritual, that he magically knows the future, if you will. And that option is sort of a catch-all for anything we don't know about God. So the mystical capacity, it could encompass any, question mark about, well, I don't know.
No, I think that's true. And to be fair, I think the view that you hold, like I said, I think the view that you hold is probably what most Christians I knew growing up would have expressed it in terms kind of similar to that. Well, God just exists at every single moment. And I'm not technical enough in this to be able to argue cogently one way or the other. I would say that, again, you know what I would say because I've said it already, but I on a B theory of time, I could see how that would happen. I can't understand that on an A theory of time, and that's where, for me, Molinism rescues it. But I definitely do think, because most people want to admit that temporal becoming seems real, right? It seems weird that, we could click over into the next day, but that day was already there always, and we're just kind of, going through somehow time, even though we're not experiencing its legitimate passage, which just seems weird to me. So anyway, that we're outside of my pay grade now on how well I could argue one way or the other. But yeah, that's interesting. And I do think you're right. The sort of, God's declaration of the future, that sounds like theological determinism to me. And then the mystical view, that always is used as kind of a catch-all. Well, just because we don't understand it doesn't mean that God, and Craig addresses this in The Only Wise God, which is a great read. I highly recommend you read it. But he addresses, this mentality of where it's like, well, that, God is greater than us and higher than us, and there are things that God will understand and we'll never understand. Well, I mean, duh, like, of course, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to understand God and to understand how things work, because it could lead us into a much deeper and more fruitful relationship with him. So we should try to expand our knowledge of God.
So I think that you can rescue the incoherence of B theory if you stop seeing time as this sort of static object that has always sat there, and rather see time as a collection of moments, all of which occur, but they occurred simultaneously. So every moment feeds into the next moment, but all of these moments happen. They don't not happen. They happen.
Right.
They just happen in a collected order. So you can say that it's not as if this moment has been sitting here for eternity. No, this moment is happening now, as all moments are happening.
Yeah, maybe I'm just not smart enough, but that doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know. I'm again, I just don't understand. Caleb, do you understand that? I mean, I just don't. I don't understand. Do you guys get what he's saying? I'm not sure I understand it.
I get the distinction he's trying to bring in here. I'm personally not sold on either theory of time. I've played around with some of my own thoughts on it on
You've got
different timelines.
The C theory of time for Caleb, right?
Yeah, so I think we may be dealing with a situation where we have one timeline, like God's obviously outside of, but we also have the spiritual realm, and the question is whether that's timeless or if it runs on a parallel timeline of some kind.
Right.
So I play around a lot with this, so I get where Joel's coming from, but I personally am not entirely sold on either.
Gotcha. Interesting. Cool.
Well, my view actually has a much more developed form than that, but I'm only talking about the one part of a larger view, and I'm not going to get into this because that wasn't what this episode was about.
Yeah, we should do that sometime, though, because I'm interested to hear more about it. I would love to understand kind of the broader, the broader. See, a lot of people, and here I'm going to get in trouble now, but like a lot of people are theologically bound to their view of this. And I mean that, of course, we're all theologically bound by some things, of course, but I mean church tradition theologically bound to accept some versions of this. And for me, I'm not. I just want whichever the one is, seems to make the most sense of the way things are. So yeah, I'd love to hear another perspective on that.
All right, we could do an episode where we try to bring in somebody who has more of a Calvinist view, Arminianist view, Molinism, and then I can present my really whacked out.
Just hash it around for a little while, toss it back and forth. That sounds like a lot of fun, actually.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've got 4 guys here, so we could, if one of us can bring one of those perspectives to the table, then we can kind of produce a informative view, and then after we've each expressed our views, we can have a cage match.
Sounds like fun.
I like it already.
Yeah.
Next up, young Earth creationism.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of theological positions where people are just really entrenched in their position. So.
Now, before we leave, I believe we have a listener who had a weird Bible passage question for us.
Yeah. So, we have this coming from Mr. Jackson. Grace and peace to you. I don't think this falls in the category of weird Bible passages, but does Scripture prohibit women from being deacons?
Depends on who you ask. I personally... I don't necessarily have a problem with female female deacons or even female pastors per se. My main issue is that so many of them turn out to be very liberal and tend to reject the traditional teachings of Christianity on things like abortion and same-sex marriage and things like that. And of course, that also could just be kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because it's usually the more liberal denominations that tend to produce female pastors, and that's why they would tend to have these more liberal positions. But that's also why I'm a little more leery about these women pastors, because so many of them turn out to be very liberal in their views of the traditional Christian teachings. I can kind of see both sides. I grew up Southern Baptist, and in our church, absolutely no women pastors or deacons, because men were called to fill that role. Women just were not. That was just how Scripture taught. But I also think there may be something to the argument that when, for example, Paul talked about how he does not permit a woman to speak in church, a lot of that had to do with the fact that women in that time were not well educated. And so when a woman were to speak up in a church service, it would sow confusion. And so that's why they would order women to remain silent, is because they were not able to bring up, they might have been well-meaning, but they were not able to bring up good talking points or, be able to contribute meaningfully to the conversation. Now we live in a culture in which we do educate women, and women do have a lot to contribute intellectually. So it could be the case that these prescriptions against women becoming deacons and pastors had to do more with the fact that women were not well educated, which of course would not be the case now. So we wouldn't necessarily have to abide by that. But then there also is the argument that men and women are created to fulfill certain roles. And, for example, we read about deacons that a deacon must be the husband of one wife. So kind of sounds like, well, maybe Paul is assuming that only men can be deacons. Otherwise, they would have said, they can only have one spouse. But instead, he specifically singles out men, saying that they have to be the husband of one wife. So, I can kind of go either way. I kind of lean a little more toward, we can allow them to become deacons and pastors because, there were in Scripture women who led when there were no men who were able to take the lead. So I kind of lean more toward that. But, I definitely see the arguments for both sides.
Yeah, go ahead, Caleb.
I was just going to say, this is an interesting one for diving in and doing some word study on this kind of stuff, because in 1 Timothy 3, where it describes the qualifications for deacons, in verse 15 in verse 10, after kind of finishing up this discussion, it says, "And these also must be tested first, and then let them serve as deacon if they are found blameless. Likewise, also with their wives." That's that passage Clinton mentioned. They must be dignified, not slanderous, temperate, faithful in every respect. But the word wives there is also one that could be used for deaconesses. And then, we have Paul in Romans 16, verse 1 and 2, talk about Phoebe. And the word again used here is the word for referring to her as a servant or a deacon. So, I don't think it's something that's particularly clear in the text. I think there's arguments that could be made from both sides, as Clinton's kind of already pointed out. There were certainly other issues contextually back then as well, because temple prostitution was such a big thing within many of the cities. And so, just coming from Paul's view, there would have been certain issues with it, which I think is why we see these passages where he's against women teaching within the church. It's given this very specific context. But then we also
covering
see
their head and things, which would have been sort of culturally related, probably to what you're talking about, the temple prostitution and so forth.
Right. I mean, some of the medical textbooks, 200 years before this, by Hippocrates, indicate that, the woman's sexual center was essentially within the hair. So they thought, the reproductive aspects were actually tied to the hair, which may be the reason for, the hair coverings coming into some of this.
Yeah, you're right. That's a really interesting take on that passage. That it just sounds so crazy. Like, how do you ever talk about that in church? But
very carefully.
That's right. Yeah, Clint, and I you really expressed that well. I, for what my opinion is worth, I am in the same boat. I mean, I grew up independent Baptist, of course, and I still attend a independent, just unaffiliated Baptist church. We're not Southern Baptist or anything. And we, I mean, definitely, it's the men only, in those leadership positions kind of tradition. And so, I mean, I guess I'm a little biased by my raising that's the view I tend to lean toward. But I do see these difficulties. I do see where these word studies are necessary. The passage you mentioned there, where it talks about the qualifications, and it could be the word could be used. I totally get that, and I respect that. I think what Clinton kind of mentioned a little bit about just kind of the argument from in general how God seems to have designed things, given men the responsibility for their homes and things like that, just the structure of the family in general. I do think there's an argument there. I think you either have to, and maybe I'm simplifying this too much, but I think you either have to say, well, the whole thing about the patriarchy, and I know that's a triggering term these days, but like either the male was given such responsibility and headship in the Bible because that's how God actually designed the world to work properly, or it was a product of their culture and we are not bound by those cultural restrictions today. I honestly, I don't know where to go with that. I think there's arguments that could be made on either side. I guess I'm more, I don't know if I want to call it safe, but I'm more in the camp of the way I grew up and the way I was raised, because it really does seem to me like even when you look at cultural fatherlessness and you actually look at this, socio-cultural studies that have been done in comparison with the way that God seems to have structured the home and the church, et cetera, to work throughout the biblical text, it really does seem to me that there's something to this idea that the male is the leader, but he also bears the responsibility. Now, where I take issue with people is when they push it like you can only like to what you can reduce this to absurdity, right? Like what happened? Like does that mean that a woman? I mean, a male child, right, is still like a male. So I mean, is like in what situations is it appropriate for a woman to be teaching a class in a Christian school? Like can there be a Christian school teacher who is leading and has authority over senior males, right? And that are 17, 18-year-old males, and there's a 22-year-old teacher in the Christian school. I mean, I've totally seen that scenario. And so males in our culture at 18 years old are considered adults, and obviously 22, 23-year-old women are considered adults. At what point does it become absurd? I don't know, but I think there's something there to both of those sides, because you look at leaders in the church like Phoebe, like Deborah, and others who are commended for their faithfulness in the roles that they play, Priscilla and Aquila, and you think, well, surely there's certainly a role here for women to do. I guess the question is, which role is it? And that's, and if I just may real quick say that if you for 1 second take what I'm saying and interpret that as sexism or whatever, then you don't know me, but you also don't understand my point. Like it has nothing to do with sexist or women or lesser, like whatever. Like my wife could kick my butt. Like my in our marriage, like my wife is my strength. I mean, I don't have strength if it's not for her. I mean, she's everything. I lean on her. I hate to be cliche, but she's my rock. She really is. And I don't know very many happy males who are in a marriage who don't feel the exact same way. It's not that I think of my wife as lesser. It's that God gave her a specific role and gave me a specific role. She has different responsibilities. I have different responsibilities. She is held accountable for things that I am not held accountable for, and vice versa. And I think that there's actual evidence in the world that God designed it that way. So that would be my basic opinion on that. I take a more broad approach to it.
I think that also one ought to keep in mind that in the ancient church, they didn't have the luxury to do what we're doing right now, sit around and talk about theology all day. And, I mean, in our churches, there's so many programs, and you go to Sundays or every Sunday service, and there's a guy standing up talking about the Bible to you. If you look at Paul's letters, a lot of it are like, thank you for sending this help to me. The brothers ministered to my needs. Send, my texts with Titus and the 3 belts that I left behind, kind of thing. And, when they talk about these deacons and so forth, a lot of what they're talking about is ministering to physical needs and emotional needs. Not so much all of this Bible talk all the dang time. And, there weren't that many copies of the Bible out there. They didn't have that many scrolls and everything lying around to read the Bible. It was just those individuals who had memorized enough to talk about it. And unfortunately, women were not allowed to sit at the feet of rabbis. But there is one exception of a rabbi that allowed women to sit at his feet and actually praised them for doing so. And that would happen to be Jesus Christ.
Jesus Christ.
And there is a very, very specific story in the book of John where there is a woman out there fulfilling her women's duties of, cleaning the house and serving food and so forth. And there was another woman who was doing the culturally unthinkable and sitting at the feet of a rabbi and learning the things that rabbi had to teach. And then a dispute arose. And, one was, why isn't she in there doing a woman's duty? And the rabbi said, she's doing the better thing. She's sitting here and learning. And so, the Bible was countercultural right from the beginning in that it did suggest that women should and would be praised for sitting and learning. And so, when they talk about the office of the deacon, we tend to think, oh, it's a guy who's going to get up and talk or organize Sunday school or do the church fund or whatever. Back then, probably the deacons were organizing charities and helping things because, back in the books of the epistles, it's talking about taking care of orphans and widows and ministering to the needs of the sick. And, that's probably a lot of what was going on in the early church. So when you think about women deacons, don't think necessarily about somebody who's standing up and teaching church. Think about somebody who's organizing ministrations to people's needs, things we should probably be doing more of nowadays. So yeah, it was a very different time and there were very different roles for deacons. And yes, the Bible did actually praise at least one woman for learning at the feet of a rabbi.
Yeah, that's a super good point. I wonder too, so my church background tradition doesn't really have elders, right? We have the pastor and then the deacons, if anything, are, they're not elders, but they're somewhat like elders, in that they help with, our church has a leadership team and we have 3 people on the pastoral staff, and then we have a leadership team made of lay persons from the church. Now, of course, there's not a leadership team in the New Testament, right? Well, there is, and they're called elders. It's different altogether. So I wonder if those who come from that sort of eldership kind of background would make a distinction and say something like, well, based on Joel's definition there, maybe women could be deacons, but women wouldn't have been permitted to be elders, and so therefore they shouldn't. And elders are in that teaching role. Again, I can't speak either way to that. I'm just wondering if any of my Reformed brethren who tend to have that kind of background would have something to say about that to make a distinction there.
There's a lot of church organization things going on in the New Testament, none of which I have paid a lot of attention to or learned about. So I don't feel equipped to have this discussion.
Fair enough. And of course, another point too is, where were they, for the, maybe not for the most part, but like where were they having a lot of church, especially in the book of Acts? They were going from house to house, right? They were having church in homes. And actually, this is, here we go on to another topic. I say this every time. I'm going to try not to get political, but there are a lot of, Well, church is essential. Of course it is, right? Where the world is in the middle of what some deem to be a crisis and what some deem to be a nothing burger. And so there's a lot of thought, well, our church, bless God, our church shouldn't close, et cetera, et cetera. And this is persecution and this, that. Now, I understand, right? I get all these different circumstances that are happening around the world are, they're unique, right? There's, circumstances in California are not the same as circumstances in North Carolina and go throughout all 50 states. But like, I mean, they were having church in the house in the book of Acts. Like the early church, they were having church in the house. So like, until they literally are barging in our house and saying, you can't have church in your house, like, get gather 4 people to your house and open the word of God and talk about, you know what I mean? And like
wear masks, maintain 6 feet of distance.
Yeah, I mean, but you see what I'm saying though. Like it's like, okay, if we look back at the New Testament model, we could learn a thing or two from that in dealing with things in these days. And maybe that's all I'll say about that, because that's a tangent. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Pretty good discussion.
Yeah.
What's so
foreknowledge, women deacons, all these crazy Bible passages, and we just barely scratched the surface on that random virgin in Bethlehem who gave birth to the God of the universe. We hardly even talked about that.
We've been all over the map.
Yeah. What was her name again? Marianne, or something like that.
Yeah, something about Gilligan's Island, I think.
Mary Sue. It was Mary Sue.
Oh, Mary Sue. Okay.
Do we have any other listener questions out there? We love getting those in. Thank you so much for submitting that one. And any other questions out there? I'll throw out a final offer before we take off of any weird Bible passages that you may have heard brought up. All right, there's a little lag, so we'll give them a minute. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and let people know where they can find people for content. You want to start us off, Clinton?
Sure. Excuse me. Yeah, you can find me on Facebook, MeWe and Gab. I have accounts there on those alternate social media sites as well, and I run a pro-life podcast called Pro-Life Thinking, in which the purpose of the podcast is to train people how to make the case for life effectively and persuasively. And so we have an audio-only podcast, which you can find on iTunes and blogtalkradio.com/pro-life-thinking. And we started up a YouTube channel called Pro-Life Thinking, in which currently we do the podcast as a live broadcast on YouTube, where people can watch, comment, and ask questions of our guests, that kind of thing. And then we extract the audio and put it on the audio-only podcast afterward. But we're about to start branching off and doing videos that are specific to the YouTube. So if you would like to get free training on the pro-life physician, then by all means, check out our podcast, subscribe, and hit the notification bell on YouTube, and listen to our audio-only podcast. But if you want to get the most out of it, it would behoove you to listen to the podcast and to watch the videos, because we do unique content on both. So we're going to start, I have a lot of plans for the YouTube channel as far as actual training videos. The podcast can take anywhere from half an hour to an hour, but the specific training videos I'm trying to keep shorter, between about 5 to 15 minutes, something a little bit more bite-sized to give you some good content. And those are the videos that will only be there. And I have some other types of videos in the works too. So definitely check both out. Because I think both will be really beneficial, especially if you are interested in what the pro-life movement is doing, but also in what the academics are publishing, what kinds of arguments, and how the academic discussion is going, and that sort of thing.
All right, thanks, Clinton. Steve, what do you have going on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm still kind of in flux here. I'm trying to keep up with this business that fortunately God has really been blessing ever since I went full time in January. And I'm still just trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up with respect to ministry. So it's been a little while since I've done much, but if you're interested, you can find my material at steveshram.com. You can also use Enduring Together. No, is that what it is? I always forget this. Is it Enduring Together? I think so. I think it's enduringtogether.com. And that also redirects to that website. It might be a little bit easier to remember. But historically, we have the Bible Nerd podcast and then Bible Nerd TV on YouTube. And then just the blogs that get written over at steveshram.com. And so I'm really thinking and praying about what to continue doing, what's the most fruitful thing, what fits the best into my schedule. Ideally, I would just do it all, but currently my web design clients seem to be more apt to pay my bills than anybody funding ministry activities, and that's okay with me. Whatever the Lord wants, but I do need to figure out how it all works into my schedule. So if you want to, I'd love for you to make that a matter of prayer for me as I'm deciding what I want to be when I grow up with respect to ministry. I will say that I'm really loving some of the opportunities that I'm being given in my local church. To do some ministry, and they're actually giving me a class on theology and apologetics starting in April, which is just that's just so exciting to be able to contribute in my local context there. So I feel like I'm getting a chance to contribute, but I would appreciate your prayer in terms of public ministry. I'm still thinking about, well, do I keep writing at steveshram.com, or do I, with all the Ravi stuff and everything that happened lately, I've really been reflecting on that. Does it need to become something, does it need to continue but become something other than my name? So just be in prayer for that if you don't mind. But steveshram.com, and you can find everything that's going on at any time. So
Thanks, Steve.
thank you.
Joel? You are muted, sir.
So probably just going to go the lazy route and say, go to joelfurchess.com. My book is there, and I'm currently posting research on there. My blog is there, including a bunch of articles I've written on my Necessary World theology, if you're interested in the more fleshed out version of that. And my I already talked. My art, there you go. My art is on there as well. And so between all of those things, you get a pretty well-rounded picture of, who I am and what I do.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be lazy too. I just help run these things on the web. That's it, and do whatever else I can get my hands on. So you can also find another show I work with some gentlemen on over at Question Christianity on YouTube or Facebook. We have discussions as well. They're a little more not quite as in-depth or as apologetically nerdy as this program is. So if you need something less nerdy, you can go check that out. If not, though, we hope you will stick around here and continue checking out the content we're putting out. I can promise you it's always nerdy. So, you're always going to get some kind of reference here. I think, Clinton, you went on a 20, 30-minute diatribe on Star Trek not but a couple episodes ago. So,
was it that long?
yeah, I'm pretty sure it was. I don't know if I cut the feed halfway through or what, but but point being, if you like this kind of stuff, hit notifications, hit subscribe. Share this around. If this would be helpful to somebody else who's maybe brought up one of these passages, please share that around, get this into their hands, and then have a discussion with them about it. So, that's it. So, any final thoughts, guys? I don't see any questions coming in.
I'll give a quick final thought of just dig deeper, keep digging, and if it sounds weird on the surface, it's probably really cool below the surface. So dive on in. Don't be afraid. It's fun. The water's fine.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that. Is that two things that have helped me tremendously when coming across these challenges, because weird Bible passages are most often brought up by people who think the Bible is weird. And the first thing is read the entire context in which the weird thing is taking place. We've already addressed the sort of Tamar thing here by reading the larger passage, and we addressed the Elisha thing by reading the larger passage. And of course, when we talked about the sacrifice of Isaac, we talked about the entire life of Abraham leading up to that point. So knowing where the story is taking place and what's going on in the surrounding history of the story often helps to resolve the problem itself. The second thing is it's really, really important to understand that the Bible takes place in an ancient time where things were different culturally and in terms of understanding than the 21st century that we come from. So if you can try to imagine you go to, say, a ghetto in India, people will be behaving very differently there than they will here in America. And you might see some people doing things which are kind of bizarre to your eyes, but it's normal there because of the history and culture in which it's taking place. The Bible isn't taking place in 21st century America. It's taking place in a very different cultural context than now. And so when you read a weird story like this, like the Tamar one, try to dig in and figure out what the cultural context this is taking place in. The biblical context, yes, but the cultural context as well. For instance, in the Tamar story, the widow's right thing is not a problem that we would have nowadays, but it was an issue that existed within that time and place. And understanding that sort of makes the whole passage clear. So, understand the Bible in the cultural context, how it would be understood to its original readers, and also understand the story in the larger passage context in which it takes place, and that resolves practically every single one of these bizarre issues.
Well said. Well, on those notes, I don't have anything else to add. Clinton?
No, I think I've said about all I wanted to say on the issues.
All right. Well, with that, I will roll us out. Hope everyone has a good night. Hope you found something valuable here. Have a good one.